Childhood trauma doesn't just stay in the past. It can shape our relationships, behaviors, and mental health well into adulthood. But how do we recognize these patterns? And more importantly, how do we begin to heal? Wendy Castellino has been helping people do just that for over 35 years. As an accredited CBT therapist and EMDR specialist, she has dedicated her career to guiding people through trauma recovery with evidence-based strategies that create lasting change. Today, we explore how childhood trauma manifests across lifespan and how Wendy's approach helps people break from its hold. If you are caring for someone else, whether paid or unpaid, and no matter how many hours you do it, did you realise that you may be missing out on thousands of pounds of discounts for things that you may use every day? The Able to Care podcast is proud to be sponsored by the UK's #1 carers card. Started by two best friends who recognise that carers deserve better and are 100% committed to helping to change the lives of all carers and bringing them together as a strong community. Carers Card UK provides support, recognition and rewards. It offers reassurance by providing an ID card that helps access emergency information when needed, while also unlocking discounts, a wellbeing hub, a carers circle tool and a community through their app. All of this for less than the price of a box of chocolates a year. There are discounts on gym membership, days out, electrical goods, clothing and even glasses. Let others know you care while taking a little care of yourself with an ID card you can be proud of. Visit carerscarduk.co.uk/promo code/able to care today to order yours. Welcome to the Able to Care podcast, where we explore the stories and expertise of those dedicated to understanding and supporting others. Today, I'm joined by Wendy Castellino, a highly experienced psychotherapist with over 35 years in the field, specializing in cognitive behavioral therapy, EMDR, acceptance and commitment therapy, and mindfulness. Wendy has helped countless individuals navigate the trauma and reclaim lives. Hello, Wendy. How are you doing?
Hello, Andy. I'm doing very well. Thank you. And so much for asking me to come onto your podcast.
Yeah, it's definitely lovely to have you on. And I'm really looking forward to get into this episode a little bit. Something that from all of the different environments that I've worked in, we try and make sure that we are trauma informed across the whole kind of spectrum of all the environments we work in. But there's a lot of misunderstanding and people not realizing how early life experiences can impact across the whole spectrum of life or the level of life. So first off, tell me a bit about yourself. What got you into therapy to start off with?
Okay, so I think at school, I started off being very good at drama, basically because I had so much drama in my own life. I was very good at portraying it as well. So I actually started going to drama school, which was an experience in itself, probably added to my traumas as well. But I definitely had mental health problems, had low self-esteem, and it was really hard for me to get any work and everything like that. So that was quite depressing. And then I suddenly heard about, I did some community drama. Then I heard about drama therapy. And so I went and did a course on drama therapy. And I really felt that was me. I really felt I found myself. So I started off training as a drama therapist, but then I went on to do additional training in sort of more psychotherapy type of things. And then cognitive behavioral therapy came along. So I did that. But I also practice what's called third wave cognitive behavior therapy, which involves sort of new therapies like acceptance and commitment therapy, compassion focused therapy, which I'll talk about a little bit today, and dialectical behavior therapy, and also mindfulness as well. So therapy is continually evolving and moving on and everything like that. And I think that's really good and very healthy. So I try as much as I can to keep up to date with the practices in therapy, so I can be the best person I can be for the people that I serve.
Do you think, so therapy, as you said, it has changed significantly over time. And I think growing acceptance of therapy, of being kind of a normal part of people's lives. And obviously there's still elements of stigmatization around you have to be ill to see a therapist. Or do you still get people who visit you that are expecting the couch to lie down and you tell me about your childhood kind of situation? Or do you think people have now been exposed to enough different forms of therapy that they know that it's not like that anymore?
Well, some people do still use that model, and that's fine for them. But I think cognitive behavior therapy really contributed something different to therapy, because it really brought science and evidence into it before and said, well, what actually works? Let's actually bring some sort of measurements and some evidence, some better, more thorough ones as well. So I think that really helped to increase opportunities for people to access therapy more and more, because there was some science behind it. It became a bit more kind of like, yeah, this is good for us. And if we just sort of get better at understanding it, we can actually make more use of it. So yeah, cognitive behavior therapy is often used now in NHS services. So people are actually more familiar with that term. They might not know what it means, but they've heard the term cognitive behavior therapy. So I think that's helped a lot of people. And also just being more open, perhaps on social media. There's perhaps less sort of stereotypes around what a male or a female should behave. There's a little bit more diversity around, which I think helps people to think it's okay to come and talk about your problems and to understand yourself a little bit better.
One of the things I've heard with cognitive behavioral therapy, obviously you've gone into a slightly more broad array of different forms of therapy as well. And I know that I think is only two different forms of therapy that have been clinically tested. And I think that is CBT and EMDR. I think the only two that are recognized as officially tested. But otherwise, yeah, there's lots of different forms. I think I've heard a lot of, I don't know whether you've encountered quite a lot of kind of negative preconceived ideas around CBT, particularly because some individuals have engaged with it within the NHS, and it's felt a little bit like, well, I've got 10 weeks of almost going through a workbook, and at the end of it, I'm chucked out the other end, and that's the end of it. There is a big difference, and I think there's a misnomer, isn't there, as far as, there are good and bad therapists out there. There is also good and bad therapy out there, and different therapies suit different people as well. But just because you've experienced, it's like me going and watching a movie once and going, well, I didn't enjoy that movie, so movies aren't for me. It's like, well, go and watch a different movie. You might really enjoy that. So have you found that the same with CBT as well?
I think the research is the most important aspect of all therapy is the relationship. So before you actually do anything, get a book out, it's back to how much you kind of work with that person feels supported, understood, that the therapist sort of meets their needs as well. So that's the number one fundamental thing. And I think I'm quite keen on people bringing what they need to bring to therapy. So if you sort of impose a structure or a book with them, then that, they can read a book or they can go to a course. It's much more about the individual person and understanding their situation is the number one key thing to actually enabling a person to help them. The rapport, the trust, the understanding, the collaborative working relationship, that is all what I think helps a person to feel as though they're getting something out of therapy.
So if you were to sum up kind of what is CBT, we'll start with CBT. We might ask about some others as we're going along, but what is CBT, or how would you describe that?
Well, cognitive behavior therapy has actually gone through 3 stages. So the first stage is really more of a behavioral therapy approach, which you had examples of Skinner. They did tests on dogs that they rang a bell when the dogs ate. And so what happened when they took away the food and they just rang the bell, the dogs were expecting the food, so they salivated. So that's like a behavioral experiment, really. And then along came Beck, and he actually used more cognitive. Sort of the thoughts are important, our beliefs and how we view and how we appraise the world is just as important as behavior. So that was called wave 2, second wave. So you had a first wave behavior, second wave is cognitive behavior. The third wave is these new therapies such as mindfulness, which are really building upon that and growing. And actually it's a lot more rich now, I would say, and new things are coming in as well. So there's a little bit more of a menu for people to choose from, so that they can find things that suit them a little bit better. So yeah, there's more of an expansiveness, there's more of a diversity now. And I think that's a good and healthy thing.
I know obviously there's lots of different forms of therapy, and I know that CBT is quite grounded, it's quite directive. It's kind of basically built on the principle of behavior, thoughts, and feelings all being interconnected with each other, aren't they? And that's kind of so working with people to kind of change all those three areas of life. Potentially they're changing their thoughts, changing their behavior, and then working with them to change their feelings as a result of that. And how do you find that? So with trauma, particularly if we're putting that kind of lens on it, how do you feel CBT kind of works alongside the kind of healing from trauma?
So there is actually another thing, I think, cognitive behavior therapy, and you're right, it's cognitive, which is the thoughts, behavior is how you behave, and therapy. They missed out emotions, which I think is something not
yeah, they did, yeah.
important. So there's actually different types of cognitive therapy for different sort of conditions. And people can argue that it's not right to put people, sort of like, so if you've got anxiety, there's particular type of therapy, cognitive behavior therapy would be anxiety. So say you've got social anxiety, there's a whole sort of treatment plan around social anxiety. Panic disorder, there's a treatment plan around panic disorder. I think that's actually quite useful as a sort of basic standing point, and you can actually go back to those theories and explain things. And actually, the explanation I think that CBT has brought is also really good. And so CBT does actually have a process for trauma. It's called trauma focused therapy. And again, there's lots of research into this as well. So there is this particular way of doing things in a certain order to actually help a person to sort of process their trauma. And basically, if I can just give a sort of an outline of what that involves, if that's okay with you. So the first thing with any therapy, I think it's really important, is again to establish rapport, find out what the person wants from the therapy, what are their goals for therapy, to make sure that you can meet those goals as well, make sure they're realistic, and being specific as to what they actually want. And then it's actually perhaps understanding a little bit more about their problem. So we do an exercise, it's called case conceptualization. Sometimes it's called hot cross bun, where you actually write down situation, how it makes them feel, what they think about the situation, any physical reactions, and as a consequence, what their behavior is as well. And actually just putting that down on paper. It's a very simple model by Christine Badesky developed that. But it can really actually help people to really understand a lot more about what their connection is between their thoughts and feelings, behavior. So understanding their problem. And then I think the next step really is building some resources. So what I mean by that is nowadays people perhaps would benefit from doing some breathing exercises or relaxation exercises or mindfulness, or creating a place where they feel calm and safe and relaxed. So they feel they've actually it's a bit like driving a car, I say. In order to drive a car, you need to know how to stop it before you start going. So these resources are to make a person feel safe, feel they're in control, they've got some emotional regulation going. And then the next step is you start to work through the bits of the trauma. Again, it should also be negotiated with the actual person as to what they want to work on first. They might want to work on a smaller trauma first to sort of see how that feels. And processing can take all different forms. It can be talking through it. It can be writing things down. It can be listening to it and playing it back on audio, whatever the person sort of feels. But it's important that they talk it through, really. And the details are quite important. And the next step, I would say, is reframing that as well. So maybe having a different interpretation of the story as well. So rather than I failed and I got it all wrong and the world's horrible, maybe the rewriting of the story is much more as I didn't get it all wrong. I didn't fail. I tried really hard. It wasn't my fault. And as a result, I've learned something from this experience. So it's that sort of reframe of that process is really important. And I think the final step is really living your life as well. It's sort of making sure you don't go back, but also you start to move forward and you start to make positive changes in your life, which you actually want. Reclaiming your life is a lovely phrase, I think. So that's also important, that once they've actually worked through all the pain and all the terrible things that they went through, they think, okay, now I'm going to start living my life. I'm not going to make any more, I'm going to live my life regardless of whether I'm making mistakes or not. I'm going to move forward and reclaim my life. So that's it in a nutshell, Andy.
Yeah, that was great. Great explanation. It's really interesting to kind of hear the journey that somebody will go through to kind of overcome or to work through that. And I think that's an important thing. Sometimes it can be hard for people. It's a bit like, I don't know, sometimes you just want to be better. You just want to flip a switch and go, yeah, just make me better, sort this out, whatever it is. And it's not a passive activity. It is a journey. And like learning to drive a car, you're just going, well, can you just make sure I know how to drive a car? And we just kind of then inject that knowledge into your head. It has to be a case. I'm afraid you're going to go through you're going to stall the car a fair few times in the process of learning this. And you're going to have to, you can't just drive once and then think you can pass your test. You're going to have to practice this almost on a daily basis to kind of get those new habits created and make it become second nature. And I think that can be really hard for people, depending on where they are in their journey and whether they're ready for that, the commitment themselves. Sometimes I'm sure that's something you find with them, that, you know, whether they're ready. I'm not ready to drive yet, essentially. Like I still got some work to do, or I'm going to do it a bit. I'm going to do a couple of lessons and then I'll take a break for a few months and then I might come back and try again. And I think that's okay. That's the important thing, isn't it? That it's, as long as the ultimate goal is to come out the other side.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, one thing I think really helps is if people just make a small change as well. So it could be like just getting a meditation practice going. And even if they're really busy, it could be 1 or 2 minutes, or, you know, the classic going for a walk scenario, or just trying to do a little bit more exercise if they can in their life as well. So just sometimes those small changes and actually, oh yeah, that's what I feel actually, because sometimes people know the theory, but for some reason they find it difficult to put things into practice. So I think that's all really part of the process. And I also think people are really brave to come to therapy, to actually start to open up and talk to somebody, and to be willing to be vulnerable and to sort of share themselves. I think that's a great act of bravery. So I know people sometimes think, you know, oh, it's weak to go to a therapist, you know, man up, man, and all that kind of stuff. It doesn't really work. It's much, much better to get it out of your system and feel so much better. And to leave it also is something about leaving it in the therapy room and going away and living your life as well. So I think people definitely should be commended for being brave enough to come to therapy.
There's some wonderful work by a lady called Brené Brown. I don't know if you've ever heard of her, where it talks about obviously the, you know, true courage only comes through vulnerability, essentially, that, you know, bravery doesn't exist without fear. Otherwise, if I'm doing something I'm not afraid to do, that's not bravery. So, or feels uncomfortable or feels vulnerable or whatever. So yeah, absolutely. And I think it is commendable to start any journey around that. So we backtrack, because I'd like to talk about EMDR at some point, but maybe we could come back to that because it's quite a specific form of therapy, isn't it? So, but let's, we've been talking about trauma, or maybe using this term, but I'm trying to think whether any of my podcasts have ever actually kind of defined it, because it's a term that's thrown around all over the place. And if you're a paramedic, your understanding of trauma is very different. So how would you describe to somebody what trauma is?
A really good question. I think there is something basic about trauma. It is really an experience of something which you found emotionally distressing, a significant event which you found emotionally distressing. And you can go down there's criteria for mental health as well. So you can have a single event trauma, which is often called PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, or you can have complex trauma, which is more where you have several or ongoing examples of trauma, which probably affect you much more deeply as well. And you can have something called adjustment disorder, which is basically trauma that you really can't sort of get over as well. It sort of stays with you, and you know, adjustment, you find it very difficult to adjust. Say, for instance, you've been in a car accident and you've got pain in your body, and you're very nervous about driving. That could be an example of you're trying to adjust to your situation, your new life, and you'll find it very, very difficult. I think there's something more fundamental about trauma, because sometimes people don't meet the criteria for mental health, you know, and so they call it something else. But I think if it's an emotionally distressing experience the person has, then it's for them to define trauma. And also we can then look about, okay, how can I best help you to overcome this trauma? So in many ways, it's more important that the person that I'm supporting defines their own trauma, because it's their own personal distress. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's the thing to understand, isn't it? That there is no set criteria of the incident or the situation must have been this bad to meet the criteria. Under diagnostical criteria, that can be the case, as far as, you know, something that's perceived as life-threatening to you, yourself, or others, that you felt helpless or hopeless in the situation. But when we're looking at kind of the broad spectrum, It's very much, two people could see exactly the same or be involved in exactly the same situation, exactly the same car accident, for instance, and one have PTSD and one have no ill effects whatsoever. So it's not about the severity of the event. It's the ability to process, or the way that the body and the mind process that information afterwards that then defines it. And even if we took it away from trauma, I think nobody escapes this life without baggage, even if you're not labeling it as trauma. I think there's been some things in my past, whether it be being bullied, whether it be, transitions, going through parental divorce. These are all things that they wouldn't necessarily perceived as their traumatic events, but they could be enough to affect a person over their lifetime. Is that what you found?
Yeah, very much so. Yes, they would be, as the individual, would experience them as traumatic events. Absolutely. And there's certain things I think about life stages as well. So, a classic example where I think people do experience a lot of trauma is, sort of teenage times. So if for some reason they've been bullied at school, I think that's a massive trigger to trauma later on. So many people I've spoken to have been bullied at school for some reason, because then they just have to keep going. And sometimes, schools haven't sort of responded the best to the situation. So it's like an ongoing trauma. If you're carried on being treated sort of with hostility or with hatred, that's a terribly difficult thing for a person to experience when they're sort of young and their brains are still developing and everything like that. And often the parents be helpful or not helpful, but often they try and help, but often they're not really heard or ignored as well. So definitely bully would be one of them as well. And then obviously as you're treated as a child, as a baby, if you small things can make a difference to a child or a baby, like, whether they've been self-soothed or held or kept warm, all those type of things. If they haven't sort of felt self-soothed by the parent or the caregiver, that can actually lead them to an anxious attachment as well. So they never really feel sort of self-soothed. So they this anxiety can happen from a very, very early age. Even before they can speak, they might just felt that anxiety. So that could be an example of a trauma that they don't even know they forgot. But they feel different, or they feel very anxious all the time. They feel insecure. And then that gets transcended into other relationships as well. So somebody who's experienced childhood trauma, for example, research says is they're much more vulnerable to picking up an abusive partner who sort of almost notices that they're vulnerable and takes advantage of them and then starts to treat them or abuse them themselves. So that could be very difficult for an individual.
Yeah, the adverse childhood experience studies that were obviously came out kind of really brought to light, didn't it? This longitudinal study of how those early life negative experiences that then can be mapped out in significant correlations with, as you rightly said, being involved with an abusive partner, higher risk of certain autoimmune diseases, for instance. And I think that's what a lot of people, we separate it up. So obviously trauma comes from the Greek word and literally means wound, which is why it comes from the, or paramedics use it related to an injury. But we're looking at this it's an injury to the brain, to the psychological or emotional system of some degree. But it's that they're so connected, the body and the mind, that, so do you think as far as, how this early life experience and early life traumas, have you found people that it's they've started to be aware of it, maybe because it's manifested in how they're feeling on a day-to-day and their body and their reactions to things? What tends to cause people to come and visit you about trauma?
Well, I think often what happens is, again, there's two types. PTSD is more, single PTSD is more they've had a trauma in their life and it's been significantly impacting on their life. So, classic symptoms would be, nightmares, so they can't sleep at all well, or they're having something called flashbacks where they feel as though they're back in the situation, they're sort of reliving it again as well. And just sort of, one person described trauma as it's like if your body was like a house, it was almost like the foundations of your house have been rocked. So the whole of your personality feels different as a result of the trauma as well. I think that really describes it well. The idea they don't feel themselves anymore. So some people come because they've had a trauma in their adult life and they want to sort that out. But another sort of type of people come because they've maybe had something going on in their adult life. It's reactivated things that went on in their childhood as well. So they're struggling, for example, with relationships is a very common one. Say relationships at work, or they're arguing with their partner or something like that. And when they sit down and think about it, it's often that they link back to what happened in their childhood and know there's lots of things that weren't right. So you're working with the current traumas, but also it can be really helpful to work with the childhood traumas as well, where the actual event came from. And another point I just want to make, Andy, is often there's a book called The Body Remembers, and it actually says that actually trauma is actually held in the body. I think when I do EMDR, there's lots of sort of stuff around the stomach as well, so this sort of part of the body as well. So it's almost so you hold the emotion of the trauma in your body as well. So it's often a very physical thing, and that's why I think you can have immune problems as well, because it affects the entire body. The whole system is affected as well. So it can be very, very distressing to react to these traumas all the time.
Absolutely. And obviously, it may not be something that somebody is cognitively aware of or necessarily making the connections as well. But I know there's, a lot of evidence you can actually see differences. And I think in when I've looked at the brain, sometimes there's an enlarged amygdala and things like that for individuals who've experienced significant trauma. So their alarm bell, I always describe it like an alarm bell, the danger receptor, if you like, is actually bigger in people who've experienced high levels of trauma, which means it's hypersensitive and it's switched on a lot of the time, which then we know that high levels of stress without appropriate regulation and management, because stress isn't a bad thing, it's just the processing of stress that's important to kind of recognize, obviously then impacts and affects the whole body as a result, as you rightly said. Do you think so that there are certain therapies and certain approaches that it's quite important to maybe get the right form of therapy and approach for things, especially around childhood trauma, especially like risk of re-traumatization and stuff like that? Is there certain therapies that kind of work better for trauma than others?
That's a very good question. And I suppose what I think CBT brings to the table really is the amount of research that has done over the trauma. And it doesn't mean to say that other therapies aren't effective at all. Sometimes people, like psychodynamic therapy, it's very important. The relationship is very important in that. And the person often does talk about their past and their experiences. And just sort of being listened to and witnessed to those traumas, I think could be very, very effective. Just actually being able to share it and talk about it and to express how they feel. Again, if you've got a good therapist who is just there witnessing and listening and allow the person to tell their story, that's really good. There's another therapy called narrative exposure therapy, NET. Again, that's got some research to it. And it's particularly good for people who are asylum seekers or people who've had sort of quite a disjointed life. And basically, what they do, they tell their story. In a nutshell, they tell their story, and the therapist sort of records it and writes it all down, and they sort of go over it again and again until they sort of feel they've fully processed the story. There's something quite nice about starting at the beginning and going through the story of what happened and when it happened, and then this happened and that happened. So they've got like a connection. They've got like a line going through their lifeline, really, and they understand that as well. And they also celebrate positive bits as well. They also celebrate, things that went well in their story as well. But actually having a cohesive narrative, I think, is important in those kind of therapies. So yeah, there are definitely more than one therapist, but I think CBT just brings that research element, which I think is very good, because I think you're making a very good point also, is because it is so painful and it's so distressing. It's so important that the therapist is properly trained in these areas so they don't come and just let them blurt it all out without any kind of thinking about how to do this and how to make sure the person feels safe, in order that they feel contained is a good word. They feel safe enough with the therapist that the therapist can listen to them. And another point, I think, is when you're talking about trauma, you've got vicarious trauma, which means that by listening to somebody else's trauma, you can be traumatized yourself. So you can listen to, like, sometimes if you've got parents who are arguing and you actually hear somebody hitting each other. That could be an example of a vicarious trauma. You're not being hit yourself, but you're listening to somebody being hit. So that can be very, very distressing. But also, people who I support also might worry whether they're going to distress the therapist as well. Is a therapist robust enough to listen to all this? Or so I just miss out a few bits here. I miss out the really bad stuff because I'm too embarrassed or ashamed to tell them, or they can't handle it. So I think it's really important the therapist has to think about, are they ready to handle the distressing stories that the client needs to tell them as well? And are they feel strong enough to contain it, and also make sure they get support so that they don't become overwhelmed by the stories as well.
That's the importance of supervision and things like that for therapists, isn't it? That I know that, so the two people I've solicited problems most, I've heard that quite a few hairdressers actually have therapy because they spend a lot of time listening to traumas and bad stories and stuff like that. And it does wear down on you. As you said, there's vicarious trauma, there's compassion fatigue, there is secondary traumatic stress disorder. There's so many kind of, interconnections that supporting and working with people who have been traumatized can be traumatizing if we're not careful and managing our own self-care, which is why it's important to, as you say, seek a licensed therapist to go down that journey and somebody who's going to approach it the right way. Have you ever encountered an adult or child's behavior that has felt difficult, overwhelming, or challenging? Have you sometimes felt at a loss of what to do, or know that you didn't handle it quite right? People are complex and unpredictable, and their behavior can be like the weather. We've all made the mistake of looking out the window and feeling safe to wear shorts, but 5 minutes later, wishing for an umbrella. But what if, like a weatherman, you understood how humidity, temperature, and pressure all come together to cause the weather, allowing you to better prepare, predict, and respond, and prevent ever having a picnic ruined by a thunderstorm ever again? My book, called Targeting the Positive with Behaviors that Challenge, helps you to become the weatherman of behavior. It provides you with a toolkit to increase competency, confidence, resilience, and empathy, so you feel more assured about how to respond to distressed or dysregulated behaviors in others, including those affected by trauma, mental health, neurodiversity, learning disabilities, or dementia. Build better connections, achieve de-escalation, and improve outcomes for yourself and those you engage with my celebrated 6-stage target model, a step-by-step process to reduce distress for everyone. Discover my empowering, person-centered guide in Targeting the Positive, written by me, Andy Baker, available from online bookstores worldwide. Find a link in the description and order today. So on that, we've got this thing called EMDR. Okay, so I know a few friends who've engaged EMDR. I know a bit about it as far as some of the science and stuff like that behind it. But it's demonstrated to be really effective around helping people, particularly with simple PTSD, as far as the PTSD form. But as well, they're starting to find research around the complex as well. Would you mind telling me, how can you explain how it works? Because do you know how it works? Because I think that most people don't really know how it works. But why is it effective, and how do you go about it?
Well, EMDR, I mean, it's such a weird name for therapy. It stands for eye movement desensitization reprocessing. What does that mean? Mm-hmm. So how I normally explain it to people that I support is, one of the theories is that when we sleep, we dream, and we have something called rapid eye movement. And that's a bit of a strange thing. And that's been quite well researched. Why do we move our eyes quickly while we're dreaming? So one theory is that the process of moving our eyes helps us to sort of like process stuff that's sort of been on our mind in the daytime, so that we kind of like have a little bit of a cleanup really, and sort of put things into perspective. And often people say, sleep on it and you'll feel better in the morning. There's some truth in that. Sometimes, you feel different about situations if you've had a good night's sleep. So Shapiro, Dr. Shapiro, she took this, Francine Shapiro took this idea, and apparently the story is that she was walking around moving her eyes, and she noticed what she was sort of looking at things. She actually started to feel better. So she thought, there's something in this eye movement. So basically, it's moving your eyes when you're awake rather than your sleep. And there's something about the processing and moving the eyes just helps to sort of like, take things take things out which have been bothering you and looking at them and processing so that they actually go to another part of your brain as well. They move from the amygdala to another part of your brain, so they don't seem quite so intense. And also tapping is part of EMDR as well. And it doesn't really make sense about that. But there's something quite soothing or rhythmic about tapping as well. So they seem to think that seems to help people as well. So that's how they think it works. I often call it as a sort of like, what I like to call it when I explain it to people, it's like a natural healing technique. So it's actually using our eyes, which is a natural way of healing ourselves. And if you actually accept that, okay, this is just something that we've just learned about our bodies that we didn't know existed before, and just listen to our bodies and what they're saying and everything like that, you can actually tune into EMDR really, really well and think, okay, I know that bit's gone, but there's a little bit underneath that I need to work on. And then I'm going to actually focus on that as well. So I find it one of the most effective therapies. I was a real cynic years ago. I thought, oh, rubbish. But I kept meeting therapists who'd done it and everything like that. And when I sort of trained, and of course you have to experience it, and I thought, wow, this is really amazing. And I think so EMDR, what you can do is you can process anything. So you can process images, you can process physical sensations in your body, you can process smells, audio, all the senses you can actually process. So sometimes people might be, say they've been on a boat or something like that, the boat sank and everything like that, and they just hear a piercing scream, and that's the one thing that sets them off. So then you'd work on the piercing scream and actually get that down, so they don't actually have a sort of like a reaction to a piercing scream. So that would be an example. But I think what is really interesting about EMDR is often when you focus on the bodily sensations as well. And I think the reason why it's so effective is sometimes this is sort of beyond our actual conscious awareness. It's something in our body that has been there maybe for a very long time. And actually by focusing on that feeling and processing it, it gets less. And people often feel lighter after the session. They actually feel they've released something. It's very, very powerful. And you can sort of start at levels as well. So I might start when I do EMDR, obviously the explanation and they understand what it is and make sure they're happy to do that as well. And then again, use the break method. So you do create a calm, relaxing place or something where they feel safe, or that you do some regulation breathing, all that type of thing as well, before you actually start doing the processing. And what I find works quite well is you do a small process first. So they actually get a little taster of EMDR before you go into the full-blown sort of trauma. And then you can decide what order you put the trauma as well, because there might be several events even if it's one trauma, there might be several points, like the hot spots sometimes where the feeling goes really, really high. And that's where they heard the screaming, and that's a really one point to process. So you can actually have a decision actually where to start. So we go through it and process each bit. And then sometimes what happens afterwards is, say, if somebody's got complex trauma, there's some stuff more underneath as well. So this is where they think, oh, yeah, that memory is gone, but I still feel this real sort of sensation of gurgling in my stomach. So with their consent and make sure they're happy to do that, and maybe we wait till next session, we then work on a sort of sensation in the stomach and see what comes up there. And sometimes a memory will come up, which is what the real trauma is. They're not aware of it, and it comes up. And then obviously we can process that as well. And then finally, the other amazing thing about EMDR is it's like a U. So what happens, you start high with the trauma like this, and you start process, it goes down like this, and then it gets to a point where there's nothing. If you keep going, it actually starts to become more positive. So say a person believes that they're no good, they're useless, would be a classic one. Start doing some processing and getting rid of all those traumas and everything that they've gone through so they don't feel that anymore. They actually start to believe they're actually not useless. They're actually a good person. And this belief that they're a good person becomes stronger and stronger and stronger. So, or lovable is another really good one. Nobody loves me. Everybody hates me. Actually, I can love myself. I am lovable. And also you can do that as a separate one. It doesn't always have to go like that. You don't have to wait till the end. You can actually get a person to work on their lovability, or they're confident, or they're good at something as well, and process that. And that works amazingly well as well. I've done that with lots of people, and they can't believe the difference, because this is in one session. You can actually see quite a big difference in one session. It's that amazing.
That's kind of what I've heard about it. I mean, I hadn't heard anything about the last little bit there that you mentioned. That's new information to me. That's really cool. But the feedback I've had from people who've done it is quite transformational in quite a short period of time. And obviously, all the different therapies tend to typically have different durations that they kind of work in. So you mentioned psychoanalytic earlier. So that tends to be a little bit longer in duration. CBT, 10 to 12 weeks typically, but it depends on the person. EMDR, I've heard like 3 sessions or 1 session. It can have quite profound kind of changes for the person as far as, So obviously, because it is quite lack of acknowledgement, is this kind of within the NHS still you can get EMDR? Is this only going to be through private, or how do you access EMDR?
So there is more people being trained in EMDR. So with the therapy services provided by the NHS, they're called different things. So I can't really say. It used to be IAPT. I think it's wellbeing resources. But quite a few therapists are now being trained in EMDR. So it is possible. I think one of the difficulties really is this sort of this diagnosis thing. So sometimes it's only offered to people if you've got like a classic diagnosis of PTSD. Which might be a bit limiting, but it's certainly well worth asking. And sometimes people will go, they'll go for therapy because they're worriers. General anxiety disorder is a posh name for people who worry a lot, and that's sort of really bothering them, everything like that. But often what you find is behind that is some kind of trauma that's happened to them in their life, and that's the thing that sort of started off this worrying in the first place. So sometimes if you don't sort of get to the real cause, you can learn some skills and techniques around how to manage worry better, but you're still left with that kind of, that feeling of trauma in your body. And if that's not really dealt with, that's not going to go away. That's going to sort of stay there. So there is an argument about, asking. And sometimes what I do, Andy, is, people come to me for cognitive behavioral therapy, and we start off doing cognitive behavioral therapy, but I'm almost like listening or hearing out for, is there a trauma here, or is there some way I can use EMDR here to better help the experience as well? So, and 9 times out of 10, there is something there in their lives which they've considered a distressing emotional event. So if they're interested, we'll process that and actually see what happens. And sometimes the combined effect is quite good because they learn the skills of how to manage their anxiety, but the deep down reason why they have the anxiety in the first place often gets addressed through EMDR.
There's one way that I've heard it put, that kind of CBT is quite top down. So it's kind of working on the cognitive part of the brain and then working down into the brain, whereas EMDR is potentially a little bit more bottom up as far as the kind of the approach. So actually a combination of the two of those is obviously really beneficial for kind of covering all areas.
I think what's happened now with the third wave is there's much more body awareness. There's much more connection, with Buddhist philosophies as well around mindfulness. That's very much in the body. So especially in mindfulness, there's lots of kind of body sort of awareness, kind of body scan type of thing, the deep breathing. So I think you're right, but I think an up-to-date good CBT therapist will definitely look at the physiology around a person as well and incorporate that into the treatment plan. So yeah, I think.
Yeah, it's already starting to, as you say, blend together in the way it's grown.
Absolutely.
So you obviously have lots of different people from different walks of life and from different times in their life that come and visit you looking for kind of support and some change. What would you say are the biggest reasons that people end up coming to you and seeking out therapy?
That's a very good question, Andy. And I suppose probably they've got some kind of distress in their lives as well. They realise that they are that their lives change perhaps, and again, it could be a significant event, or they're just noticing that they're getting more upset or tired or snappy, or they're not sleeping very well. I remember one person, a couple of people actually, who had a traumatic event and then haven't been able to sleep for like 3 years. Not proper sleep. And so their life is a bit of a nightmare, really, because that's a form of torture, isn't it? Yeah. And actually, by working on their trauma, they then can sleep. So the distress of something as small as not being able to sleep is massive in people's lives. And they, they're astounded when they can come to therapy and that problem can be sorted and they can go away and their lives are so much better because they're at peace now. They get on better with their partner. Sometimes people are at this guy who's on the verge of breaking up with his beloved partner. They just had a little baby as well, but he was just so heightened all the time from his trauma. It was really having effect on his relationship. And I think they were about to break up. And of course, and he deeply loved his wife and his baby, and it was so nice to sort of take that away from him so he could go back and really function in his daily life again. So I think it's a sort of form of distress, I would say, that brings people to therapy.
I think there's a common misnomer. The example you just gave there was quite poignant in a way. So he just recently had a baby and with them was experiencing this significant distress. And I think that's one of the common maybe misunderstandings that people have about themselves, not just about kind of mental health generally, that mental health problems should be associated with things that people typically think of as being bad. So I think it's quite hard for people, like, as you say, whether it be postnatal depression as a prime example, that terrible experience for any mother going through it, going, this should be one of the happiest things in my life. Why don't I feel happy? And the guilt and shame associated they're going to have with that. And one of the things I try and raise awareness of around mental health, it isn't necessarily anything to do with it's never just environmental. It isn't necessarily something something bad has to have happened to give you the justification to feel this way. But that's where some people really struggle, and that's where a therapist moves around that. A lot of friends and a lot of family, because their instinct is to solve the problem. Tell me what's bothering you, why you're not happy, and therefore we'll figure this out. But for some people, but everything in my life is okay. So I can't tell you what's wrong. I just don't feel right about it, which is where that higher level of training of a therapist is really important, isn't it? To kind of really dig down into those, what's causing this distress at this time.
One example I use, Andy, is when you talk about the stress brain, stress brain, you're talking about the fight or flight system, fight, flight, freeze, flop, or the other F's.
Yeah.
Fawn, yeah. That's all. His friend is another one.
There's some other F's in there as well, but
but basically people are in the fight or flight. They're in the red brain and they can't sleep or they can't concentrate and everything like that. But sometimes people's thoughts are the threat. So, if you think about in the old days, it was a sort of like a monster eating you here and you were like looking at the monster thinking, I need fight or flight here. I need to run away or attack the monster. But it's the thoughts that are causing the threat. They like OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. It's the thoughts are really kind of like, negative and whining them, or people have got low self-esteem. You've got this inner voice sort of like shouting at you or putting you down or telling yourself you're a terrible person, hating them. So it's often the distress of the thoughts that I think people come to therapy for, because they can't escape their heads unless they, take drugs to sort of stop that. But it's very distressing to have those terrible thoughts in their head sort of telling you all these awful things about yourself. I think that's what happens a lot.
And I think that's important, isn't it, to almost destigmatize around mental health as well. Let's say this is a natural physiological system that actually has allowed our species to survive for however long. If we didn't have our fight, flight, freeze, fawn, flop kind of responses, we probably wouldn't have survived as far as when we weren't top of the food chain. And if I let a tiger, loose in a room, I would hope that everybody in there would have some level of emotional survival reaction to that. The problem is, as you said, it's the thoughts that are now triggering it. It's but they're still kind of natural. The negative thoughts are, if I'm unlovable, I'm rejectable. Well, rejectable wouldn't have been good for me when we were part of a tribe where suddenly then I'm not liked by the tribe. I then am some level chastised or pushed out of my tribe. I probably would have died if I was then isolated. So that thought process is still perfectly natural from evolutionary understanding. Standing in front of 500 people, they're not actually a threat. They're not a tiger. They're not going to hurt you. But, public speaking, one of the things that most people say is number one on their fear list, because it is a fear of rejection, the fear of what if I'm perceived as not good enough or making a mistake? So therefore I'm going to be rejected by 500 people. Well, straight away from a tribal point of view, makes complete sense. So I think sometimes we have this shame and stigma associated, but it's just because there's that little bit of kind of malfunction that's going on, not recognizing, right, I don't even know these 500 people. They're not really important in a tribe. I've still got my mates and my family and stuff like that. They'll still love me unconditionally. Suddenly the opinion of these 500 are mattering to me because it's a misfiring in my brain that's completely normal.
And I can say nowadays, it's not the threat to our, in UK, basically, it's not a threat to our lives or anything else. It's a threat to our ego, our sense of self, like you say, the fear of being humiliated, embarrassed, thought badly of, rejected, mocked, criticized on social media. It's our own sense of self, really, is where the threat comes in now more. The psychological, emotional threat to how you see yourself is the important thing. And that's where people kind of get caught up in that, really, as well.
And it's obviously quite a journey to untangle that and create these new habits as well. I'm just thinking then from the podcast, we could have people who I should imagine who are listening to this, who maybe have got a loved one, or, whether it be a foster parent who their children are in some form of therapy. A lot of the children's homes that I go and work at and go and work with, they have psychotherapists who come in and support the children and things like that. And what I rarely see is at the other end of the spectrum, very rarely see, CBT for dementia, for instance, can be really beneficial, especially at the early stages of diagnosis, to help reduce the distress of getting this diagnosis of a terminal illness and stuff like that. So I think some people may be aware it's important for people who are being cared for, whether that be children with neurodiversity or mental health issues or trauma, all the way to, mental health conditions and elderly mental health conditions as well. But I think it's important to kind of, for the carers themselves, that how many of them are exploring some of the stuff we've spoken about, to really kind of dive into that. And it's a big thing to be caring for others. So therapy is part of that self-care process. Would you agree?
Absolutely. I think what I often say about therapy, it's the goal of therapy is to have a better relationship with yourself. Because if you can then sort of like work better with yourself, like you spoke before, Andy, about emotional regulation. So if you feel out of control all the time, you don't feel in control of your emotions, again, that's a very distressing feeling. And if you've got a child at home where you don't feel in control, and you feel, you're out of control, you feel a terrible parent, everything like that, then of course that's going to cause you distress. So if you can come to therapy really, or get some support where you actually feel as though you understand yourself better and your reactions and everything like that, and then you can feel more in control. And then when you feel in more control, then obviously that helps the child as well. You can teach the child things. That's one thing I quite like doing, is actually having a parent and child in the room together. And sometimes they talk together and, they snuggle up and they do some practices together, or they take it home and talk about it. Because you actually, because there's a relationship there that you're working with as well. So I think that's quite nice. And hopefully they see it as a safe place where they can talk about things and everything, and explain and talk about each other's perspectives is also really interesting as well. So, I think self-care is just absolutely fundamental. And again, the messages we're given in, the media as well, sometimes they're so provocative, aren't they? And they're always so bad and so disastrous, and all these terrible things are going to happen to us. And that can really affect our well-being and our self-esteem. And so even more, I'd say, with the demands of society, the need for self-care is so important. And I think you're less likely to get illnesses as well. The idea of having a lot of stress in your body, a lot of cortisol, it's not good for our bodies to be stressed all the time. We should be more like cats who sort of like lying down sleeping, and we're the other way around, aren't we?
Horrible and knocking things off sides.
Be more cat. But we're kind of like resting for like 4 hours, and the rest of the time we're just running around doing everything. Yeah. And then I'm not good enough, and I haven't done this, I haven't done that, I haven't done Johnny's homework yet again. Oh, I'm such a bad mother. All that kind of stuff. Whereas, but actually just giving yourself time, or one thing I do a lot with people who especially got a lot of stress in their life. It's just finding those little moments where they can just chill out. And sometimes it's only like 2 minutes every hour. It could be that small, but just putting that little small change into their life, and they just do a bit of breathing exercise, or they just take a time out, or they do a 5-minute walk or 5-minute mindfulness practice. Something really, really small, but that in itself can make a difference to think, okay, well, I'm feeling much better now. Oh, there's something in this, And also medication, if it's okay if I just mention medication.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course.
Okay. So a lot of people now, they go to the doctor and they have 5 or 10 minutes to tell them their thing. And so the doctor says, well, which medication would you like to try, really? Not even therapy. And so people are trying to get better through medication. I'm not against medication at all, but sometimes it can be quite confusing as to what's working. Is it the medication? Is it changing the practices? So, because medication can have side effects as well. So sometimes people feel worse when they start taking the medication. They think, oh, should I carry on or not? So it can be quite confusing as well, or whether the medication's right or whether it's not agreeing with you. So you try another one, you look at, or come off that one, or you can stay on medication too long as well. So that can actually have side effects as well. So sometimes what I like about therapy is they are natural techniques that can help you, and actually just trying those and see if you feel better by trying these natural techniques. They don't have side effects. They're free. It's something that we can all do as well. So just the well-being of the nature of the nation can improve just by learning some few basic techniques to help them to self-soothe and calm themselves down, and try and sleep better as well.
Yeah. So there's a couple of bits that I think are really important, what you just said there. And one, acknowledgement that for some people who are experiencing significant psychological or emotional distress, they may need some medication, even if it's just temporarily, to help them to be able to cope with the next step, to move on to anything else. So it's not to kind of dismiss or discriminate anybody who's taken medication. I know you weren't doing that in the slightest. But I do think that it should be almost kind of mandatory if they're offering medication, but we're also going to promote this or encourage this or allow access to this at the same time. Because I do think it should be a temporary solution to the problem, because I had a friend who'd been on anti-anxiety medication for a long time, and she wanted to come off it. But then suddenly when she came off it, she had no ability to be resilient or to be able to manage her emotions, because she'd numbed herself for that long, that suddenly when she started experiencing this anxiety again, it was 10 times worse than it would have been if she'd been kind of working through and helping to manage it and recognizing it. You think, like, if you've never experienced pain and then suddenly pain gets switched on one day, that'd be 10 times worse. It's like, I've got my shoulder hurts all the time. I'm sorry if somebody else comes into my body, they're going to go, how do you live with this? But it's a case of, well, it's just my shoulder, because it's been that long. And I'm not saying that's necessarily a good thing, but I think a sudden pain is obviously something overwhelming. So having the ability and strategies and stuff to prepare for it, or slowly kind of keep coming off the medication to kind of go, okay, how can I cope with this right now? Let's see how we're going. Am I in a good place with everything else that's going on? Let's try some new strategies. Experiencing this is so important as well. So,
yeah, just to reiterate, I'm not anti-medication at all, and I think it has a very important part in people's lives. But I think sometimes what can happen is if they try both at the same time, it can be quite confusing as to what's working and everything like that. And sometimes an approach what I suggest people do is they just maintain their medication for the moment, whatever it is they're on, and don't try and sort of play around with it too much. Then try these practices. And if they feel good about the practices and they feel they're learning a lot and they feel more stable at that point, with consultation with their physician, their doctor GP, they can start considering reducing their medication if they feel right and stable enough as well. So it's a very, very slow process, and if they want to as well. So yeah, I think it's something about not being confused when you're trying too many different things and you're changing the dose all the time, and then you just don't know which one's working really. So I think negates the confusion that sometimes can come with medication.
Yeah, really good points, Wendy. Thank you. So as we sort of draw into a bit of a close on this, a couple of bits that I wanted to kind of talk about. One is if somebody was looking or exploring the possibility of therapy, what would be potential their first step?
Very good question. So sometimes the best thing to do now is just Google. What will happen now is loads of therapists or therapist organizations will come up. One of the interesting things that's happening now actually is there's more opportunities now to have internet therapy, basically. So traditionally people would actually go and find somebody local and go and see them. There's nothing wrong with that. And some people still prefer the human connection face to face. There's nothing wrong with that. And that's fine. So that's finding a local therapist. So putting in your postcode and seeing what therapists come up. I think the next step is to actually, look at their qualifications, their credentials and how much experience they've had. And if they cover your area as well. So say you've got anxiety, then obviously you want somebody who's got some experience, or they say they've got some experience in anxiety or trauma or whatever it is that they think they've got their problem with. So that's, look at the therapist and sort of thing. And the next step was probably an email and try and have a conversation with the person. Feel as though, is there a nice fit with this person? Do I feel comfortable talking to them? Do I feel as though that, they'll understand me and everything like that? So I think they're the steps. But to add to the other one is if you want to have therapy and you don't mind being on Zoom or something like that, that does actually expand your opportunity to find a therapist who's perhaps a little bit more specialized in your area. So say you've got a good example now is neurodiversity. So say you've got ADHD, you don't have to limit yourself to a local therapist. You can just put in ADHD therapist. And if you're prepared to use the internet, you can get somebody who's perhaps a little bit more aligned to your speciality as well. So that's something else to consider. And I do therapy online. I never meet the person at all, because the furthest I've done is Australia.
Okay. time zone challenges there, I should imagine. But
it wasn't actually. It was quite good. Yeah.
Was it?
Yeah. We didn't have any problem with the time zone. Yeah, it was. We managed to work that out as well. So so that actually sort of adds to the choices and richnesses of therapists you can actually have if you're prepared to do that.
It can be quite nice in some ways as well to kind of step outside your own town, especially if you're a little bit more self-conscious or a little bit, because although, there will be professional boundaries and your therapist should set up with you what the protocol will be if you meet each other in the street and things like that as part of your beginnings. It can be nicer to kind of go, nobody in this town will know them. They don't know me or anybody I know. And that can keep that very, very separate. If you're a bit more of a private person, I think that can be really positive and beneficial. So the last kind of bit I wanted to go, and I will finish off with how people can get in contact with you, Wendy, and find out more about what you do. But I'd like Wendy's top 3 mindfulness tips. That's right. Have you got kind of 3 exercises that your favorites you encourage people to do mindfulness with? Yeah.
So I think my favorite one is mindfulness of pleasant events. And there is a form of this, and it was on the MBCT course, where you actually sort of set an intention that, okay, I'm going to notice things I find pleasant today. Okay, so you set that as an intention, and then you go along your day, and actually you start your brain, you focus on things that are pleasurable in your brain, so you actually notice them more. So you might just notice something like a sunset would be a great example. Or a bud on a tree as well. You just notice it opening up as well. So you can write about that and reflect on that later. But it's that just paying that attention to something which is pleasant. I think that's really good. Our brains are naturally more negative orientated. So actually we have to put in those kind of things as well. I think another really good and simple one is mindfulness of daily activities. So what this involves is such a simple idea, is that when you're doing something like having a shower, you try to have a shower mindfully, which means is that you feel the sensation of the warm water on your body. If you're using shower foam, you sort of enjoy the smell and the sensation of the shower foam on your body, or the nice warm feeling of the water, or cutting yourself up with a towel afterwards as well. So that's a really, really good one.
But I think one of the things that you said, all of those that you mentioned, I do so much work with, whether it be carers or foster parents, particularly, where They know they're supposed to put emphasis on their self-care. We do an exercise at the beginning on a scale of 1 to 10, how important is self-care? And they all say 10. They know that's what they're meant to say of importance. And then I say, okay, out of your day then, how much importance do you actually put on self-care? And they're then down in the 3s, 4s and 5s. And so, well, where's this disconnect then? Because if we said how important do you think food is for survival, you'd say 10. So how much of your day do you put? Well, we make sure we eat every day. So why are they not corresponding? Because you don't really believe how important it is. And it's or there's the excuse, is the ambivalence of I know I should, but. And the most common one you hear is, oh, I wish I had time for that. But you will be in the shower. And even if the kid's still talking through the door, put some music on so you can't hear them, lock the door, just focus and be in. And if you can take your daily tasks and suddenly make them mindful. I always talk about, I still do it occasionally where I mop. I have a martial arts studio. And although I've got a cleaner, I sometimes still go down and mop the mats because just that changing color from the light to the dark, with the color change from going dry to wet, and just going through the process and being able to look at it as a whole and go, I finished that. But I'm in the moment. I'm not doing anything else other than that. And I'm very, very mindful or aware that I'm doing that as a mindfulness kind of technique. And it's a job that needs doing anyway, but I keep that to one side because I just find that therapeutic. And that's it. It doesn't need to be, I've got to find time for an hour's therapy dribble, or go into the gym for an hour or whatever it is. Hey, do 5 push-ups and just go in the shower and just think about the water on your body. And that's it. You've done your therapy and your exercise for the day.
And something which makes me smile is some people come to me and they say, so what helps you now? What makes you self-soothe? And they come and they look embarrassed and they look all ashamed and says, oh, Wendy, I really like cleaning, actually. I really like cleaning the house. Well, that's fantastic, as long as you're not obsessed about it. But, there's something very therapeutic about just moving your body as well. And the nice feeling, I suppose, if it gives you a bit of a dopamine rush, is that you feel you've done something, you've accomplished something. And it's something about, you're out of your mind and into your body as well. You're doing an action as well. And they feel it's a useful thing to do. So, a lot of people say to me cleaning, but they say it with shame and embarrassment. There's nothing to be ashamed and embarrassment about just enjoying cleaning. Whatever it is that you find useful and therapeutic is absolutely fine.
Absolutely, yeah. For me, mopping the floor, mowing a lawn. I used to hate ironing, but I quite enjoy my ironing now.
Yeah.
I put my movie on and I use that as a kind of a therapeutic,
Yeah.
Again, it's mindset rather than action, isn't it? It's how you feel about it, not necessarily what it is.
Food's another good one as well. Actually, just eating mindfully, just taking your time, ideally as a family sitting together if you can, and just sitting and enjoying a meal. I know it sounds very basic, but actually just eating a bit more slowly, really tasting your food, smelling the food, enjoying your food. That's a very simple one as well. But yeah, that's very good.
I teach one about just a raisin. So you just eat a raisin.
Oh yes, that's the raisins classic one. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. But just eat it really slowly. Really enjoy that raisin. Well, Wendy, it's been absolutely fascinating chatting to you, and I feel like we've obviously could talk for quite a while, you and I, waxing intellectual and exploring psychology. So, how can people find you, and what can you do and help them? How do you help them?
So, my website is just wendycastellino.com. If you can't spell my name, but spell my name. I think it's on the show notes, or it'll be written there as well. Mm-hmm. So that's the name of our website. It's just an easy thing to remember, really. And there's resources there, and you can send me an email there as well. Sometimes you just Google my name, my details will come up. But that's probably the best way to get hold of me. And have a look around my website, and hopefully you'll find some resources there that you find useful, which are free. And get in touch. If you're interested in having some therapy, again, you can just contact me via the website, info@wendycastellino.com, and just send me an email and I'll reply. Happy to hear from you.
I know you also have a podcast as well, don't you? So do you want to tell people what your podcast is called?
Yeah, my podcast is called Don't Get a Therapist Yet. It has some really good guests. Somebody called Andy Baker is on there, which is really, really good. And the idea behind that is to educate people who are suffering mental or emotional distress to learn a little bit more about what can help them as well. And I've interviewed so many people who are experts in their field as well. So again, they can get some really good information about various forms of mental health issues and learn from that without paying a penny. So I know therapy can be expensive. So why not, offer all these amazing tips and tricks to people so that they can actually empower themselves and learn themselves. And I think we agree, podcasting is quite a nice way of, you can put a podcast on while you're doing the ironing as well, or doing cleaning, just sort of listen, and you're actually educating yourself as well.
Yeah, definitely. And excellent. And I've listened to some of your episodes and they're fantastic, Wendy. So definitely worth a check out for anybody who's listening. So for anybody who's been listening to today's episode and you found anything we've spoken about useful, or you think it could be useful for somebody else, please like, comment, or share it with that person. Do check out the details. It'll all be in the show notes as far as how you can search out Wendy and look at a website and get some of those amazing resources that she offers for free. But otherwise, thank you very much, Wendy, for joining me today.
It's been my pleasure, Andy. Thank you very much for asking me to be a guest. It's been really interesting. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. And thank you very much. Let me ask you a question. Do you ever find the pressures of supporting, teaching, or caring for someone else overwhelming and wish you had access to more support and information? The Able to Care podcast, in connection with Able Training, has created the ablehub.uk, where for less than the price of a coffee a week, you can access exclusive podcast content, resources, events, and over 45 certified online courses, covering topics like self-care, understanding dementia, neurodiversity, first aid, conflict management, financial advice, and so much more, with new content and courses being added each month. We are so confident that you will benefit from the Able Hub that we are offering 14 days access completely free of charge. No contract, cancel anytime. Become part of the ablehub.uk community and gain the support, knowledge, and resources you deserve. Don't struggle alone. Be able. Find the link in the description.